Although each touch on different subjects, I think in some ways that may have come out during the presentation, but definitely came out as they shared their papers, is that, and some in more explicit ways and some in more implicit ways, is the role of Guru Gobind Singh, those that writings were whether authored, whether commissioned, or as Guru Gobind Singh even as a subject, come out in some ways in all three papers. So my goal as an initial discussion when I pose some of the questions is actually to try to get some of the panelists to actually talk to one another to see what are questions of conversation, contention, or potentially even overlap between the three papers. So to begin with, Sonia, of course, was able to at least display a wide variety of images of Guru Gobind Singh as a subject, some even potentially from the period itself, especially an image that was both in her presentation as well as that of Sukhdeep's. And so sort of an initial question, and I'm going to pose a series of questions before turning it over to the panel who we'd actually rather have we'd rather listen to than myself, is in what ways has Guru Gobind Singh's sort of image you've seen sort of transform over times? What are subjects in different periods that you saw had certain more valence in a certain period of time, and which subject matters have sort of been lost? What are images of Guru Gobind Singh that were considered significant at some periods and maybe less so at others? With Sukhwinder's topic, looking at the question of Virag, William Pinch has written quite a bit, and this is in some ways to bring into conversation with some of the things that Sukhdeep was talking about, is Viragis as sort of warrior traditions within sort of broadly what I'll call Hindu ascetics. Although this is not limited to that, people like Richard Eaton have written quite a bit about something called Sufis that are often at the leading of expeditions, both in terms of whether it be in conquest or even in developing new lands, especially in Bangladesh or even in Punjab. So I would love to hear sort of in what ways does that sort of overlap, this sort of, what I'll broadly call a warrior ethos, and see if that term, is that something you'd agree with or disagree with in terms of how the idea of Virag also plays a role or doesn't play a role in that. And with Sukhdeep, our last presentation, where he, probably for the first time talked about this figure of Kharag Singh, which many of you may have heard of or may not have heard of, and he gives an overlapping and overwhelming amount of data in terms of how he kind of concludes that one shouldn't only focus on questions of authorship, but we should actually look at the content of the Dasam Granth itself. So I'll kind of reveal sort of my own bias in terms of where we have such a huge corpus of literature from at least the time of Guru Gobind Singh. And language politics seems to be playing a big role in there. I looked specifically in a paper I had written at the Hajuri Ratnama, sometimes incorrectly called the Chopa Singh Ratnama, where language is actually being contested in terms of what in that case, what the Sikhs themselves generally seem to, even in dialogue form, tend to speak Punjabi, while what are called the Musadde Sikhs, which generally came from, they weren't born within the tradition, but kind of adopted the traditions oftentimes as poets, scribes, who very much speak a sort of Braj-inflected language. So, although you've talked about Braj as a possible bridge, I'd also love to hear some of your thoughts as Braj as a limitation as well. What is the imagination that a Braj opens up, but also what does it close off? And since you presented so much, such a great amount of data in terms of why this is sort of central, and interesting threads that one could do with it as they like in terms of Ajit Singh as a figure, and is there valence there with Sahibzada Ajit Singh? But I also like to say as as like we put it for any hypothesis, can it also be falsifiable? So I'd love to hear if you also had some data that you're still kind of wrestling with that may not fit the schema yet, but you're still sort of thinking through as well. So I'll turn it over to the panel for some initial thoughts, and then it'll be open to the entire audience.
Excuse me. Okay. So, thank you, Dhami, for putting it all together so well. And your question, which was for me, was how the portrayal of Guru Gobind Singh has evolved or progressed from our earlier paintings that we have to what are the contemporary arts. And the earlier paintings, the older artworks that we have, are mostly portraiture. And they are expressions of the artist, whereas that artist is informed by the society at that time, the culture, the norms, the fashion, and the backdrop that the artist visualizes the guru in. But as we progress to more contemporary artworks, we see that, I perceive it that way, is it has evolved to now the portrayal of the guru is more on what values we want to project, what are the sacrifices that were made in his lifetime, or what is the message that we want to give. So those subjects or those messages are more and more used by the artists, whether it is the Sahibzadas who are shown in the picture, or his martial spirit as well, and the lifetimes, and what are the messages or the teachings that we want to give out. So we saw those in the paintings by Sukhwinder Singh as well, in which the story is trying to be portrayed in that particular paintings. So this is my perception of it. And unfortunately, we don't have very many older paintings in all the collections all over the world. In a very fragile medium, most of it is not available. And also that during the Guru's lifetimes, probably there were not very many actual portraits made. Most of them that we have are from the Punjab Hills School of Paintings, and most of them were done during the period of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, when the patronage to the artists was provided by the court of Lahore. Thank you. Okay.
If I got your question correctly about sort of how does Vadog and sort of the Saint soldier aspect, how they sort of intermingle, I think they definitely do, and as Sukhdeep was talking about how in Krishna Avatar it's talking about Dharam Yudh and also Bhakti at the same time, so they definitely do play a role. So Vadog isn't that you only, as I was mentioning, you just don't become a force stower. The entire point is that you're still a Christi, that you're still living in this world and you're still a saint soldier. And sort of just addressing something that you hinted towards about there being sort of research done on Vadog and these sorts of things outside of Sikhi. So I forgot to mention this in my presentation, is that within Sikhi, Vadog isn't mentioned. There hasn't been a lot of research done on it in the Western world. So that is why I was looking at traditional sources. And so now the next step for me is sort of expanding that towards other sources in the other religions that have looked at Vadog.
So if I understand your question correctly of Rajbhasha and how it opened up avenues for Sikhs who were writing, but also did it close any down? Definitely it opened it up in terms of the currency of Braj Bhasha at that time. In the 18th century, it was very high. So you had in courts Braj Bhasha being sung, you had writings, poems in it. So it was easy to see how the writings of the Dasam Granth were framed in that context. And there's a lot of work being done on this by actually Julie Vidge, who was also at UBC, and the strategy around Braj Bhasha, why it was used, and why the type of imagery within the Dasam Granth and Braj Bhasha was being used to maybe connect with and as a strategy to help recruit from Vaishnava communities. But in regards to closing, the Gurbalas literature from the 18th century, the historical writings, were definitely in Braj Bhasha. But some of the Dasam Granth is not in Braj Bhasha as well. You have Persian writings like the Hikayata at the end of the Dasam Granth, which are short stories. But you also have the Zafarnama, and much of Braj is mixing in Persian words as well. So it's not just, one cannot think of it just as a classical Hindi, right? So definitely there needs to be further research into what was the strategy being used by authors who were writing in Braj Bhasha. Because that also, why did it stop, right? Why did Sikhs stop writing in Braj Bhasha around the 19th century, early 20th century? So that's something that Anne Murphy has talked about as well in some of her books, which is interesting. I mean, you have authors like Gyani Gyan Singh, who wrote his Pantrakash, the Veem Pantrakash, in Braj Bhasha. But later on, once that time period was also very transformative during the Singh Sabha movement. At the later end of that, he stopped writing in Braj Bhasha and just wrote in Punjabi. And that's a trend that didn't just happen in Punjab, that happened throughout India. And you see the decline of Braj. If anybody wants to read up on that, Alison Bush has written a really good book, Poetry of Kings, on that. Secondly, in regard to Ajit Singh, much of my work here, that Ajit Singh thing was just an aside. If it's falsifiable, it's just a hypothesis that, you can, philologists, it's interesting when you dive into a text, you try to see what the author was thinking, what's the context of how he was writing it, and maybe this is an aside to his young son, right? He's 1 year old, and he wants to inspire his son with his writings, and you can definitely, we have historical accounts about how the Krishna Avatar, how the Dasam Granth was being recited in the court of Guru Gobind Singh. So little Ajit Singh would have been walking around and listening to it, and when his name is mentioned and the bravery about a character called Ajit Singh, and it's just a hypothesis. And there's other moments in, particularly the Khadak Singh, the story of Khadak Singh, like the Pathans, and when I mention these type of things to my professors at university, and because Krishna Avatar is a retelling of a Sanskrit tale, there would be no need for mentioning Pirs, Saids, like Islamic names are being used to describe warriors who Khadak Singh is battling. And that in itself is interesting as to why, if it was purely just a Sanskrit retelling, why is it not true to the original, right? And it's, this type of research is interesting, so then you can kind of see the kind of mindset of who was authoring these texts, or who was having these texts authored.
Next, we open it up to the audience.
There's a couple of questions here, so I'll just kind of say them all and then address them. So is Vairag meditation or a place reached by meditation? And then the second is, what is Viraha? And the third is Jivana Mukti heaven or salvation? So I'll try to answer these as best as possible. So is Vairag meditation or a place reached by meditation? I would say that it's both. So Vairag, when you're in the state of Vairag, you are trying to meditate on that one. And is it a place reached by meditation? I would argue yes. If you look towards the life of the ninth Guru, Sukhdeep Bahadur Maharaj, they were in that Vairag state. And how did they sort of reach that? It was, if I'm not mistaken, is it 26 years of bhakti that they did? And so I would say that it's both. What is Biraha? If you were to look at that Shabd in its entirety, I think we would completely understand what Biraha is. So I encourage everyone to sort of look at that Shabd, Kali Kor Tuket Guna Kali. If you look at that, so if I were to sort of shortly answer what Biraha is, I would say that it's a pain of separation. Where you have this pain and you're longing for the one, and you sort of have this regret that you've sort of missed the opportunity to connect to that one and merge with that one. And then thirdly, is Jivan Mukti heaven or salvation? This isn't something that I've sort of looked at yet, but I can try my best to answer it. Is Jivan Mukti heaven or salvation? I would say Jivan Mukti. Mukti means that you're sort of liberated, so that it's Jivan, that in this life you've liberated from the cycle of birth and death, and you've sort of merged with the one. I hope that sort of answers your questions.
I had actually a question for you in regard to this Vairag. I found it interesting how you brought in traditional scholars and quotes. What I want to ask from you is, as you study a concept like Vairag, how do you conceptualize some of the additional writings that Sikh scholars engage with when explaining these type of terms and loaded concepts? Like, for example, you mentioned Harbans Singh Nirmala. So within the Nirmala tradition, part of the curriculum is also a text called the Vairag Shatak, which is Braj, well, the ones they use are Braj translations or retellings of an old Sanskrit tale called Vairag Shataka. And this is used in their curriculum to explain these concepts of Vairag. But the traditions that those texts emerge out of are not exactly Sikh, and the way they frame renunciation is quite different to how you framed renunciation in a Sikh context. So my question is, how do you conceptualize, or how do you use texts that traditional Sikh scholars use, but also don't, are maybe not fully congruent with Sikh philosophy?
It's a tough question. I will try my best to answer it. So how I sort of approach this, if I'm being honest, is I would approach, again, these are people that have studied. So someone like me that hasn't sort of spent years and years studying every single text. So like the text you mentioned, if I'm being honest, I haven't heard of it. But how I sort of approached it was, okay, where does Vairag come up? And so looking at traditional sources was where I sort of had to go. And so to your question, where they don't line up with what Sikhi is saying, or what mainstream Sikhi says, I would say our understanding of Sikhi can sometimes be limited, where we think that Sikhi is just this one narrow path, which it is a narrow path, but Sikhi can be broad and Sikhi can be open to other ideas as well too.
Any other questions from the audience?
May I ask one?
Oh, please.
Yeah.
This is regarding the Dasam Granth, and I just would like to know which is the oldest source for the Dasam Granth, and are there multiple versions of the Granth, and how should we, as you don't know much about it, but kind of try to navigate and learn more about it?
Right. The oldest source for the Dasam Granth, the oldest dated Dasam manuscript? Yeah. As far as my knowledge, I didn't study manuscripts exactly, but I do know that at Patna Sahib, they have a manuscript there that's dated as 1699. Now, how do we know, second question was, are there any differences in the manuscripts? There are. And there was a committee that was formed at the end of the 1800s, which did a lot of research as to the different manuscript versions of Dasam Granth that we had, and they produced a report on that. And it's from that report that we have printed, published versions of Dasam Granth today. So for example, in the Patna Sahib manuscript, you have compositions in there that are not in the printed version today of the Das Granth. So some versions of the manuscript have additional compositions, some have less, but at the end of the 1800s, they agreed upon a selection of composition that composed the Das Granth. So, for example, at Patna Sahib, you have the composition called the Gobind Gita, which is Guru Gobind Singh, or it's attributed to Guru Gobind Singh, his version of the Bhagavad Gita. And that's not in more modern prints of the Das Granth. And this is why a lot of research needs to be done on the Das Granth, because, Robin Reinhardt, who wrote a book on this called Debating Das Granth, I would encourage you to read that as a primary source, because, not as a primary source, but as a primary way of getting an introduction to the writings of the Das Granth. And she talks about, she outlines very, very nicely the debates around it, but also gives a thorough overview of the text and the compositions, what they talk about, even a little bit of comparative analysis between when they talk about the Charitra Pukyan, how does other texts similar. And so I would start there if anybody's looking about learning about what is the Das Granth. I would start at Robin Reinhardt's book.
With that, can we get a warm round of applause for our panelists? And we'll turn it back over to Jasmine.
So we've heard from three wonderful speakers, a message and a quest for all of us, I think, to use or evaluate our senses and how the use of those senses, for example, through the perception of art, might bring us closer to understanding and relating to our community. We've also